By now, you've probably heard the proposal of Pastor Tommy Rees of the Jesuit Church for the Vatican to end the traditional Latin Mass. I'm going to go over that story today, but instead of focusing on it, I'm going to interconnect it to a few other things that have happened over the weekend. And I'm going to connect it to something else that few are talking about, because the story is just the latest piece in a long line of stories from the Vatican, moving to end the traditional liturgy of the Church with heavy influence from the Jesuits. You may have noticed that the Vatican is being run by Jesuits these days, and for an organization calling itself the Society of Jesus, it has had a key role in working against the Church of Christ. So let's look at these stories and how they're interconnected. Let's begin with a story that isn't strictly about the Jesuits. It comes from novenapacem.com, and it has been repeated without notice elsewhere. From here, we learn that the Carmelite Sisters of Philadelphia suddenly, and without notice, up and left their convent and headed to greener pastures in Nebraska. Curious, right? I had known what happened before reading this because, it was obvious to me. And then after reading it, I was confirmed in it. So I'm going to read for you key sections, and you won't be surprised by this either. From nonvenipacem.com, we get this, quote, "The Philadelphia Carmel of Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and Anne was established in 1902, less than 5 years after the passing of Saint Therese of Lisieux. It has been a treasure for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia and for the nation. By the early 21st century, faced with a shortage of sisters, the fate of the monastery was in question. Then, in 2017, former Archbishop Charles Chaput welcomed a branch of traditionalist Carmelites to Philadelphia, and they accepted. These new arrivals were mostly younger women coming from Nebraska, as well as another monastery in Pennsylvania. With the departure of these 15 Carmelites over the weekend, and the recent passing of most of the original sisters in Philadelphia, the beloved monastery is left with just one elderly sister and an uncertain future. The Archdiocese of Philadelphia has not yet addressed what happened. Catholics in the Philadelphia Archdiocese learning about the departure aren't taking the news well. The presence of a Carmelite monastery is considered to be an honor and a blessing to have within a diocese. Historically, the Carmelites have been major drivers of the faith and have had, amongst their sisters, St. Therese of Lisieux and St. Teresa of Avila, both revered saints and doctors of the Church. In fact, first-class relics of St. Therese of Lisieux and her family are in residence at the Philadelphia Monastery. During the French Trouble in 1789, it was the treatment of the Carmelite nuns that ended Robespierre's reign. The brown scapular is a noted devotion within the order and with lay Catholics. Unlike the many orders of religious sisters, the traditional Carmelites have been flourishing with vocations in recent years, making their departure from Philadelphia especially sad. Locally, 4 young women are known to have joined the traditional Carmelites in Philadelphia since 2017, with others that were in formation." End quote. And there's this bit here at the end then, which gives this away, and it is speculation, but they're putting pieces together, and they do it well. Quote, "While we don't know the reason for the developments in Philadelphia, it is not hard to recall a recent document issued by the Vatican, called Cor Orans, targeting communities of contemplative nuns, which is what the Carmelites are. Cor Orans instructs monasteries to belong to a, quote, federation of monasteries, end quote, tied together with similar charism or shared geographic location. This basically erodes the autonomy of individual monasteries operated by individual orders such as the Carmelites. In addition, the length of formation for new nuns, previously 6 years for Carmelites, became 9 to 12 years under Cor Orans, which is an impediment to new vocations. Another requirement of Cor Orans is a quote-unquote religious assistant, a priest monitoring the monastery in addition to a chaplain assigned by the Federation. This further erodes a monastery's autonomy by giving unprecedented powers to the quote-unquote religious assistant." End quote. And what was the purpose of this move by the CDF? It's obvious, isn't it? It was to quash the sudden resurgence of traditionalist orders of religious, of nuns, consecrated religious, and monks, because that is what has been happening. And since the arrival of Francis in the Novus Ordo Vatican, we have the various orders of religious being the first to be forced to abandon the traditional liturgy and norms of monastic life and return to the Novus Ordo variations of worship and living that have left their orders desolate and vocations scarce. These orders were the places that new policies against tradition were first tried, with the most famous case being of the Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate, who were, as far as most of us know, the first group of traditional religious to face the music with the Vatican and Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, or the CDF. Which brings us to the latest round of trickery from the Jesuits. This order of religious, the Carmelites in Philadelphia, were most likely experiencing the hostility to the traditional liturgy of the church and the associated theology and its impact on life of nuns in that community that we all witnessed from the Jesuits recently against all traditionally minded laity last week with the release of a now famous piece from the Religious News Service. It was penned by Pastor Tommy Reese of the Jesuit Church, and it famously says that the traditional liturgy, which it calls the quote-unquote unreformed liturgy, should be suppressed and only permitted for older Catholics, and that younger Catholics should be barred canonically from attending it altogether. That would include families, and that it should wither away. One report on this article describes the decline of the Jesuits in stark terms, though. A 41.5% drop in vocations since 1977, and a total decline of half since 1965 when the Jesuits were at their peak. But let's focus on something here. Why are the Jesuits and the Vatican so deeply concerned about the ascension of the traditional liturgy? And let's turn to Father Zuhldorf, or Father Z as he is more commonly known, and his blog for this. He is a priest, a traditionally minded priest, and he says the following here on this, quote, "The number of traditional Latin masses is rapidly growing. The average age of the faithful attending them is really low. The people give more in the collection than they do at the Novus Ordo. Fulfillment of Sunday Mass attendance is much higher than most Novus Ordo parishes. As the realities of the Church in the U.S. change, those who attend the TLM will be more and more important. The number of young priests learning the TLM is growing. Eventually, as vocations drop under Francis, these men will wind up more and more as pastors, and even as bishops. The fact is, the traditional Latin rite is not going away, and it is going to grow." End quote. I'll disagree with Father Z here on one note. Most of these young priests who are learning the traditional liturgy and the traditional theology of the Church will never be bishops. The modernists promote from within. That's always been the case, and they always will do that. Many of these young priests will be either ignored or sent off to tiny parishes in the worst parts of the dioceses they're in, or worse, forced out by a modernist bishop. And why? Because the presence of these priests in the traditional theology and liturgy they offer is a stark reminder of the failure of the Second Vatican Council and its changes. Now I know there are those who say it wasn't the Council, but the implementation of the Council, that it was done wrong. But that ignores the fact that the same men who implemented the decrees of the Council were the same ones running the Council who wrote those decrees in the first place. The fruits of Vatican II speak for themselves, and 60 years later we have religious who aren't recognizable as monks or nuns because most of them can't be bothered to wear habits. A liturgy that bears little resemblance to anything historically Catholic, but does look an awful lot like the liturgy of Luther and Cranmer, and a theology that speaks more about material concerns than it does about sin and the four last things. All of these articles are linked today over at returntotradition.org. Skip past the Patreon pop-up, and if you want, and have a look at them for yourself. There's no paywall for my sources. I just put them there because I do try to follow the rules of this place. Now, the piece by Pastor Reese of the Jesuit Church is full of errors about the Council and what it called for, and Matt Gaspers of Catholic Family News took to Twitter to correct them. I'll have a link to that as well. But as Deacon Nick Donnelly told John Henry Weston's website, this cannot be viewed in isolation, but as part of the larger whole of recent events. And what have we seen recently? Despite the resurgence of traditional liturgy and theology of the Church and virtually all quarters since the arrival of Francis, he's been a weird blessing that way, St. Peter's Basilica has driven the traditional liturgy into a chapel in the literal catacombs of the Vatican, and is only permitted to be said by approved clerics, who will say what is actually called the Vetus Ordo, that's what we tend to call it now, with the theological focus of Vatican II, meaning that they will only permit the traditional Latin Mass at St. Peter's when it's said by approved priests. An approved priest means with the modern theological focus, so all your dialogue and group hugs and all the rest of it. And in addition to that, they've ended all masses at side altars in St. Peter's Basilica. And the only mass said at the primary altars, which means the ones you see when you walk in the doors, can be said per the normal schedule and only con-celebrated, which is impossible to do in the traditional liturgy. This also would make the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom and St. Charbel impossible to say at the Basilica as well. And this move has left the place as silent as a graveyard, which I reported on a few weeks ago. None of this is surprising. Now, I'm sure some will say that the nuns didn't leave Philadelphia for the reasons I said here, but remember, when Archbishop Chaput retired, he was replaced by a man that was in the mold of Francis's new springtime in the Church. His new springtime and his picks have a consistent attitude towards the traditions of the Church. Archbishop Perez is no different. As for Pastor Tommy Reese of the Jesuit Church, well, we see this as just the Jesuits priming the pump for what is coming, the suppression or serious restriction of the traditional Latin Mass of the Latin rite of the Church. And it will be because, as Massimo Fascioli said in his interview with America Magazine's YouTube channel, we can have the traditional liturgy, but not the theology of the Church. And the reality is that the traditional liturgy is the embodiment of the traditional theology. Because of that, it will be done away with. Pastor Reese knows this, and so the slow movement against the liturgy will pick up pace and move into the future. With the Synod on the Clergy coming up next year, because this will culminate in that event, who knows what will happen. Until then, keep checking on this channel, as I'll be covering all the happenings from Rome with an eye towards the traditional faith. So like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss anything. And let me know your thoughts on this in the comments, please. And as always, pray for the Church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.